when the matte black SUV crept onto the gravel driveway of the weathered farmhouse, its oversized tires crunching like a warning. 82-year-old Eleanor May Richardson stood still at the kitchen window. Her fingers, curled with arthritis, gripped the edge of the curtain gently as she squinted through the morning light. At barely 5 feet tall, Eleanor had long since stopped needing height to command respect. Out here in Pine Hollow, vigilance wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Ever since the hurricane had torn through the region last fall, there had been a new kind of rot settling in. Not in the wood or the soil, but in the air. It came in whispers, then in warnings, men in knockoff uniforms and blacked-out SUVs knocking on old folks' doors, claiming to be from the Homeowners Association. They'd vanish soon after, taking with them heirlooms, medals, and the last of someone's monthly pension. But Eleanor didn't live under HOA jurisdiction. She made sure of that decades ago. Her home was built by her late husband Samuel in 1954, when the land was still wild and raw. No boar, no duas, no rulas. Just wood, stone, and the promise of freedom. She had no mailbox inspections or landscaping citations. What she did have was a long memory and a loaded Colt M 1911. She stepped back from the window, slow but unwavering, her eyes never leaving the SUV as it rolled to a halt just beyond the porch. The decal slapped on the door read, HOA Enforcement Unit, in crooked letters already peeling at the corners. It looked as official as a kid's Halloween costume. Her heart didn't beat faster. It didn't have to. Eleanor had watched bombs fall over Saigon from a black and white TV. She'd seen her husband leave for Vietnam and return with one less lung. She'd held her grandson's Purple Heart in trembling hands. This wasn't trauma. This was Tuesday. From above the stove, Eleanor reached for the high cabinet and pulled down a wooden box scuffed and dented with age, but still sealed with the same stubborn latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the Colt. It had belonged to her father, who carried it through the Ardennes, then brought it home in '45. He gave it to her on her wedding day, saying only, "You'll know when." She hadn't fired it in decades. But every other Sunday, she cleaned it the same way he taught her. The rounds were stored in the cellar with her preserved peaches and pickles, kept dry, sealed tight. Today, she didn't need to go to the cellar. The grip of the Colt fit in her palm like it had waited just for this moment. She moved deliberately, the weapon at her side, and watched as 3 figures exited the SUV. None of them wore badges. None had name tags. Just smug confidence and mirrored sunglasses. The leader, broad-chested with a buzz cut, stepped forward and yelled loud enough for the entire street to hear. "We've received a complaint. You're in violation of HOA standards, cluttered yard, unpaid dues, ordinance breaches." Eleanor didn't budge. Not a muscle. Behind the front door, she stood upright, her Colt held low and ready. "You have no right to be here," she called out, her voice calm but iron-wrought. "That's not your decision, ma'am," the man sneered. Then, with a nod to his partner, he kicked the door. The frame shuttered. A second man circled toward the side window. The third, tall, lean, with a tattooed arm, stood silent but coiled like a snake. They weren't bluffing. They believed they had control. But inside, Eleanor stood with the unshakable steadiness of someone who'd lived through chaos before. She didn't need backup. She had backbone. Another kick, harder this time. The latch cracked. Outside, the wind rustled through the pine trees. Inside, the clock in her living room ticked its ancient rhythm. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Then the door burst open. The first man entered, heavy boots scraping across hardwood. He expected fear. He expected pleading. Instead, he saw Eleanor. She stood firm, the hallway dim behind her, the Colt pointed at the floor but steady. "Don't," she said plainly. He laughed. "You won't pull that trigger, lady." He stepped forward. The Colt barked once, the sound deafening in the small house. He crumpled, leg folded beneath him as he screamed in pain, not from the wound alone, but from the shock that she'd actually followed through. Outside, the other 2 froze. One fled instantly, crashing into a rose bush and dropping his radio. The last man yelled in panic, backing toward the SUV. 2 houses down, retired Sergeant Harold Denon had just finished his morning coffee when he heard the shot. He grabbed his Remington from the closet, called 911 with one hand, and walked on his porch. By the time he reached Eleanor's front yard, shotgun leveled, the 2 intruders were on their knees. On the ground, Harold said flatly, "Now." They obeyed. Eleanor remained just inside, eyes on the door, the Colt still steady in her hands. But she didn't need to fire again. The cavalry had arrived not in uniforms, but in community. Harold, the retired sheriff's deputy from across the street. Irene, who was already dialing the station from her kitchen. Jim, who'd started filming the incident the second he saw them arrive. The police came minutes later. Sirens pierced the calm as cruisers swarmed the scene. The 3 fake enforcers were cuffed and taken in, bruised, humiliated, and most of all, stunned. They had picked the wrong house. Within days, investigators uncovered a shocking truth. A Real HOA board member from a nearby subdivision had compiled addresses of elderly residents, those without family nearby, those rumored to own heirlooms. He'd sent hired imposters under the guise of compliance enforcement to rob them. The stolen goods had been traced across state lines. But the scam ended with Eleanor. At trial, Eleanor entered the courtroom dressed in a wool coat and soft gray slacks, her white hair pinned back with dignity. On the evidence table, encased in a display, sat the Colt. Worn, historic, symbolic. She took the stand, and in one steady breath, told the jury, "I defended my home. That pistol has protected my family for generations. My father brought it back from Normandy. My husband cleaned it every Sunday. And when the door came crashing in, it was my turn." The courtroom fell silent. No one moved. No one needed to. The jury delivered a unanimous acquittal within minutes. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed. But Eleanor said little. "I'm old," she said quietly, "but I'm not weak. And not everyone has a Colt for 1945. Weeks later, 2 members of the HOA board were arrested. Fraud, conspiracy, accessory to impersonation. The scandal spread far beyond Pine Hollow. But something greater happened in its wake. Eleanor refused the compensation check from the city. Instead, she proposed a safety initiative, free home surveillance for seniors, a hotline for suspicious activity, and monthly wellness checks funded by the city council. It passed unanimously. And Eleanor? She returned to her porch, her tea warm, her cane at her side, and the Colt now resting in a glass case beside her rocking chair, a small plaque beneath it. Carried for country. Held for home. Children waved as they passed. "Everything okay today, MS?" "Richardson," one called out. She smiled, her voice as certain as the sunrise. "Everything's just fine now." And it was. Not because the system had saved her, but because she refused to let it fail her. Sometimes justice comes with sirens. Other times, it comes with a whisper, a steady hand, and a story passed down through steel. And sometimes, all it takes to stop the dart from spreading is a grandmother with a good memory and a Colt that still works.